The Ninja Warriors again. The Re-Ninja-ing. This is a sequel to The Ninja Warriors on the arcades, as well as that one console that doesn't exist. And ironically, if you get the North American version of this game, it's also known as The Ninja Warriors. So, that's not remotely confusing at all. At least the Japanese version has the subtitle to at least tell you it's not exactly the same. And to be fair, the first game wasn't that great. It was known more or less as being one of those Taito arcade games that had one of those really wide screens like Darius. Now this is one of those games I played when I was a kid that I couldn't quite remember the name of for the longest time. And ironically, it was the only other Taito game I ever played when I was a kid. And I couldn't remember the name of that one either, but unlike Kadash, I actually did eventually get this game. And as much as I love this game, it's genuinely just kinda sorta okay. The story follows some evil dictator named Banagher deciding to take over the universe, not with the incredibly bland Unicorn Gundam, but with armies of androids. And some guy named Mulk, which is some kind of fuzzy, moldy milk drink I believe, decides to build his own androids to stop him. But these androids are unstoppable because they're ninjas. Yeah. Now this is a standard 2D beat 'em up, but before we can even get into the game proper, we have to pick our character, because we have 3 to choose from. We have the rather standardly named Ninja, who fights with his big fists and nunchaku when the situation arises. He's the big brute, he's slower than most characters, can barely jump, but he hits like an absolute truck and can take a beating himself. You have Kunoichi, who, like her name indicates, is styled after the Lady Ninjas, and she tears enemies to bits with her kunai and katana. She's a nice all-roundy character, a little bit faster than Ninja, hits a little bit less powerful, but she can at least jump, which is a plus. And you will be seeing basically no footage further of those two, because I never played as them, because we have my boy, Kamai Tachi, aka the Sickle Weasel. And as his name would indicate, he fights using arm-mounted scythes. He's the lightweight character who jumps the highest, moves the fastest, and can hit the quickest, but he doesn't do too much damage, and 1 or 2 hits and he's in a really bad spot. But more importantly, he is also the proud owner of the single greatest beat-em-up move in history, Human Blender Mode. And see, this is exactly why I remember this game, and exactly why you need to buy this game. Now, the game itself is very basic. You move from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. Occasionally, you'll be blocked off until you fight everything around you. Then you go fight a boss, finish the level, rinse, repeat until you beat the game. But what is interesting about this game is just how incredibly basic it is, because there isn't even really a depth of field here. You can't walk around and avoid enemies, you literally have to plow through them if you want to advance. And I don't just mean in the sense that you have to get to a point where it says, okay, you can't continue until you kill everything. There's not really a way to move around enemies. They just sort of stand in your way until you kill them, and occasionally they'll spawn behind you and you can kind of ignore them for the most part, until you do get stopped by the screen scroll. And that's really mostly it. The closest thing you can get to weapons and power-ups are objects in the background you can occasionally throw at enemies, but that's about it. You, as a robot ninja, are the weapon. And while I appreciate the emphasis on that, maybe kitting out your guys with more equipment would have made it a little bit more interesting mechanically speaking, but here's where the game does get good, and that is your character's abilities, because each character gets like a dozen different abilities depending on the sort of combo you set up, whether or not you're crouching, whether or not you're trying to grab an opponent, whether or not you're jumping. Like seriously, grabs alone, I noticed each character gets like 3 of them. And of course, Human Blender Mode, which still best beat 'em up move ever. And because each character has a different combat style, different combos, and different movement and a slightly different hitbox, it really does sort of end up being a game about understanding your movement, and you really do come to appreciate your movement, or else you die a lot, because this game likes to swarm you with up to about 4 enemies on screen at a time, and there are about a dozen different enemies, from standard soldiers to these big guys, Ken from Street Fighter for some reason, these lady ninjas, these claw guys bored from Samurai Showdown, Wesley Snipes making a cameo for some reason, businessmen, and these really obnoxious, big, robots that are just the worst because you can't fight them. Like, literally, they're invincible until you get behind them, which is really tricky. But the thing is, each of these enemies also have a different way to attack, and they have a few different attack patterns they can go in, which all have different angles of attack that you have to find a way to sort of weave in between if you want to try and stay alive. And again, this goes back to really appreciating the movement in this game, because there's not really a situation where you can end up completely screwed. There's always a way to get in between the enemies using your various attacks and your character's special abilities. And that in turn makes the movement arguably the most important thing about this game, because it really does end up becoming a game of finding a way to weave in between your opponents while taking them out, all without getting into a situation where you're kind of trapped in a pincer of doom. Although that said, that does happen. There is like one boss, which is basically these two really huge guys that like to get on both sides of you and hit you at the same time. And with my boy Kamaitachi here, he dies in about 2 hits. Yeah, that's not the greatest. Other than your basic combos and standard movement tech, you do have one other ability to your advantage. And you might have noticed the bar at the bottom of the screen slowly filling. This is your sort of shmup style screen clearing bomb. Okay, it's not that great. It's actually more of a combat equalizer of sorts. See, a bomb would ultimately destroy everything on screen. This thing usually doesn't. I mean, even if you take it up against a boss, it'll maybe take, optimistically, a fifth of their health off, whereas it's more useful for knocking down all the opponents rather than killing them outright. And this will allow you to reposition yourself in such a way that you're in a more advantageous position. Now, you can't stock these, and you can't use them indefinitely. Like you probably noticed, there's a little bar filling at the bottom of the screen, and until that bar fills, you can't use your bomb. And if you get knocked down, you lose your entire charging bar, having to start all over again. So basically, this entire thing is a giant risk-reward system. In terms of use, you basically have to decide, okay, well, there's a few guys on screen, I could kill them all with my bomb right now and maybe charge it up for when I really, really need it, or maybe I should hold back and wait for a situation where I have to fight a bunch of enemies that are really not ideal for me to be fighting all at once. You have to make that call whether or not it's worthwhile to take out these guys initially, and hope you'll have it charged by the time you really do desperately need it in order to survive. And likewise, building it up, you have to try and decide, okay, how do I get in between my enemies and fight them off long enough that my bar will fill? Because while I might be able to take a punch or two, the moment I get knocked down, I lose all of it. So I have to keep up the offensive in such a way that enemies won't get close enough to knock me down. But I have to keep my distance enough to try and prevent them from getting all that close, and ultimately risking my bar that way. Seriously, this thing is an amazing level of risk versus reward in pretty much all respects. I have to really give credit to the conceptual design of this. But that said, it does have its issues. Case in point, the game itself is not the most difficult up until the last 2 or 3 levels, when there's a giant massive difficulty spike, and it really does come down to moments where you wish you could just stock up multiple bombs, and you wish you never used any of them and stocked up to that point, because there are a lot of fights which feel completely and utterly unfair. Now, it's fine up to those last couple levels, but once it gets there, it is just brutally tough, and that's really unfortunate. And likewise, in terms of massive weird difficulty spikes, the final boss is just awkward and kind of dumb. I mean, case in point for the difficulty, it took me about an hour and a half to beat this game, and 40 minutes of that were spent on the last level alone. Yeah, this game is not the most well-balanced, but it is definitely a lot of fun, especially if you like ninjas, you like robots, and you like turning yourself into a human-sized blender and making a disgusting blood smoothie. Or, I guess, android green goo smoothie? Probably broccoli flavored. But in terms of gameplay, it's very, very basic. It's very simple, there's not even a depth of field, I think I've mentioned this before. So it's basically walk from the left to the right, kill everything in your way, and you're good to go, but it doesn't really even have all that much variance in terms of gameplay, outside of trying to dance between the various combinations of enemies and their attacks. And that can get really intense, and that's really well done, but outside of that, it is very, very basic, although very stylish. The presentation to the Ninja Warriors, again, is, like I just said, very stylish. The environments themselves are actually, for the most part, pretty dull and industrial, although there are a few nice ones, such as outside in like the snowy mountains, and this nice sort of Japanese-themed, I guess, hotel or something. And while I don't typically like very bland and very industrial-looking environments, the characters inside them are bright and colorful, so they do kind of pop out, and they do make a nice variance that keeps it visually interesting. And there's a lot of enemies, like I counted probably at least a dozen. And even by the last level, they're still adding new enemies, which is pretty damn impressive. The animations are incredibly good, and, well, once again, human blender mode. That's why I remember this game, that's why I bought this game. This alone is just breathtakingly awesome. The audio design to the game is pretty stellar. The soundtrack itself is pulse-poundingly fast-paced and really does make you feel like you're in a very tense, high-action situation, but you're also like the most deadly thing in the room. Seriously, the soundtrack to this game is amazing. The sound effects are kind of standard, but I do like that each character does have a sort of moan of pain when you defeat them, and there's a few different ones depending on what enemy you're fighting. And this in turn leads to an overall favorable presentation. It's visually not necessarily the greatest, but there's enough variance and the animations do pull it through. The audio is fantastic. Now, if you want to get a copy of The Ninja Warriors / The Ninja Warriors again, you're going to be spending a lot of money on this game. I got a Japanese import because the cost was a little bit less than a North American one, but I still almost paid basically $100. Yeah, this game is ridiculously expensive. And if you ask me if it was worth it, no. And, you know, I'm someone who's got a lot of nostalgia for this game. I love this game passionately, but this game is absolutely not worth that. If you can find it in a bargain bin, or you can find it at a yard sale or something, where they're charging something relatively favorable, like, say, maybe 20, 30, maybe, then it might be worthwhile, but as a beat-em-up, it's genuinely, at its most positive point, kind of just generic, and at its worst, kind of substandard, because it just does things inferior to other games. I mean, without any sort of depth of field in terms of movement, dodging things is actually really bloody difficult, and that difficulty spike near the end does not do this game any favors. But it is stylish, and it is a game that I personally love. Is it worth the money? Well, not really. I don't think it's even rare, it's just expensive for the sake of it being expensive, but I guess that seems to be the trend with Super Nintendo games nowadays. Hopefully that changes, but is Ninja Warriors a worthwhile pickup? Well, if you like beat-em-ups and you like ninjas and robots and you love human blender mode like I do, yeah, absolutely, because it's got the best beat-em-up move in history, bar none. But is it worth the cost you might pay? Absolutely not. See if you can get this game on discount, but if you can't, I would pass it up. And it genuinely tears my heart out that I have to say that about this game, because I do love it. But it's just way too expensive to justify that cost.